So imagine a child who is heir to a vast fortune, more than he could possibly imagine, businesses and lands and mansions. However, he's treated as one of the hired hands. But there's coming a day, unbeknownst to the child, that he will no longer be treated as a hired hand, but he will be treated as the master over all of his inheritance. This is what Paul argues for in the concept that humanity was once a servant and now God is bringing them into sonship. So let's look into this sixth lesson in Galatians here. In Galatians 4:1-20. In this lesson, we're going to be covering chapter 4, verses 1-20. And Paul's going to be dealing with how to transfer from slaves to sons. In the previous chapter, Paul contrasted law and grace. But now he's going to move into the concept of how to make the next step now that it's available. That he's going to argue that previously it wasn't available for humanity to make this step into sonship. They had to remain underneath the beggarly elements of false religion or slavery to the law, or different things of that nature, depending on whether they were Jew or Gentile. But now the way is made, and then now that this way is made, we can make the step. And Paul wants to contrast the differences in the two positions and then encourage the Galatians to take that step. So let's look at this here. In the start off in the first verse here, Paul says, "Now I say that an heir, as long as he is a child, differs nothing from a servant, though he be Lord of all, but is under tutors and governors until the time appointed by the Father." Now, so what he's meaning by this is he's relating back to an old custom. This was a Jewish custom, but it was a custom actually in the Eastern world, and it didn't deviate too far from the Roman custom. But the custom was this, is that a child, when a father had a child and he had plans for this child to inherit everything that the father owned, one day he would inherit maybe his business or the farm or that whatever the case may have been. But what he would do is he would take his son, and he would, for the first maybe 10, 12, 14 years of the child's life, what he would do is he would put him underneath a servant, a tutor. And that tutor would be responsible for the child's well-being and education until the child could come of age. And so what would happen is the child would not answer to the father in respects to handling his own affairs. He would actually, the father would deal with the tutor. And so, and that's not only so in the avenue where there was tutors, but it was also with the rest of the running of the business of the farm. The father would give out orders to the servants, and the servants would obey the father's orders or the master's orders. So the son received no special privileges at these times, though it was the intent that he was going to one day inherit everything. However, until an age that the father had realized that the son had come to a point where the father could put trust in him. So what he would do is he would keep getting reports from the servant how the child is doing. And the child was treated just like one of the rest of the servants. He had to work like one of the rest of the servants. He gained no special privileges and authority within the economy of the running of the house, and he had to take his place with the servant. Well, then what the father would do is he would keep getting reports from the tutor of how the child's doing, and if the child was coming along well, what he would do is the father would set aside a time to have a ceremony, a coming of age ceremony, and when he did, he would publicly adopt his own son into his family. Now, this wasn't the way our Western idea means adoption is we just legally bring them into our household. But in the Eastern world, what the ceremony for adoption would be that the child is now recognized by the father as being trustworthy in so much that his word is as good as the father's word. And then the father now has placed his trust in the child to where now the child can now start undertaking the duties of running the farm. And slowly the father will hand off duties to the son from this time forward. But up to this point, he is the same in the house as a servant. He has no authority. So this is what Paul is saying here. Paul is saying, now I'm going to read the scripture again. Now I say that an heir, see, the son, he's going to own everything. As long as he is a child, differs nothing from a servant, though he be Lord of all, owner of everything, but is under tutors and governors until the time appointed of the father. He says, even so, let's go here in the third verse. Even so, we, when we were children, were in bondage under the elements of the world. You see? And so then what he's getting at here is we were under elements of the world. Well, and this applies to Jews and Gentiles. And the elements refer to the basic rudimentary principles of religious systems. Now, one might argue that the Jews had it a little bit better because what they were serving was they were serving the true God. However, whether they were Jews and the Gentiles were serving pagan religions. So the Jews did have it somewhat better, but still at the same time, they both were serving rudimentary religious systems. And it was apart from relationship. Okay, and so then what he is getting at here is everything was a do and a don't. Even in the pagan world, it was a do and a don't, and they were barred from the relationship that true salvation brings. And so you remember in the Garden of Eden that God put a cherubim in between man and him and would not allow man to come near unto him. Well, that principle was taken down. See, and this is what Paul is arguing. The Jews believed that in their tabernacle that Moses had set up in the wilderness, and even in the first and second temple, in the temple, in between the holy places and the holiest of holies, were woven into the fabric, that curtain that separated, were woven into that fabric, golden threads of cherubims. And they believe that represented the cherubim that was originally commanded in Eden to keep God and man separate from each other. Well, when Christ died on Calvary, the curtain was split and the cherubim was done away with. Now, mankind, whether Jew or Gentile, now could have access once again to God. Well, Paul is arguing here that up to this point, no matter who you were, whether you were a Jew or a Gentile, you're still separated from God. See, the child in the Eastern world, the child was separate from the father's business. He was separated by a tutor. So the father dealt with the tutor, not the child, in the running of the child's affairs. So likewise, God dealt with the humanity under the rudimentary elements of religious systems, let's say like the law, the do's and the don'ts. and it was a dividing between humanity and God. Paul argues that now that Christ has been crucified, the bridge, the divide has been taken away, and there's no longer a need for those rudimentary elements to try to keep man straight, because now man can have access to God, and the Holy Ghost will keep him straight from that day forward. He doesn't need the religious systems to keep him straight. So Paul's arguing here that before Christ, Jews were bound under the law, and the Gentiles were bound underneath the false religion. So let's jump down to the 4th verse here. He says, "But when the fullness of time was come, God sent forth his Son, made of a woman, made under the law." You see, so Paul argues here that the time appointed by the Father was set many years ago. And once that time had been set, then now Christ came in the fullness of time. And like I've said before, I'll say it again here, that the Jews believed, and this belief was popular in the Intertestament period, that the age of humanity was divided into 3 parts. One, the antediluvian age; the other, the age of the Jews, or the age of the law; and then the third one will be the age of the Messiah. Well, they believed that once the age of the Messiah came, the age of the law would be done away with, because the Messiah would come and change everything. Well, Paul still held that belief, but he believed that the age of the Messiah was the coming of the Messiah. That age was bifurcated into 2, the first and the second coming of the Messiah. And so then, and what he was doing in his first coming was spiritually taking us out of this wicked, evil age. And it wouldn't be until the end of the age of the Messiah that he would fulfill the physical portion about reclaiming all the promises that were given through the prophets. Now, but Paul said this right here, that once the age of the Messiah had come, well, that's the fullness of time. Well, all the apostles believed this. That's why they would always say we're living in these last days. What they were meaning is they were living in the age of the Messiah. Okay, so Paul here in the 4th verse said, when the fullness of time was come. Well, now he's going to liken that age of the Messiah and the fullness of time to the same as when a father had appointed a time to adopt his son. And God is, or Paul is arguing that God had appointed a time to bring humanity back into full relationship with him again, where they had fallen in Eden, and that would be the time appointed by the Father. So, but when he says, when the fullness of time was come, God sent forth his Son, made of a woman, made under the law. Made of a woman, meaning that he was in all manners, as Hebrews says, in all manners like we are, but without sin. So he was, so that he could be a proper mediator. So, and he came underneath the law, and coming underneath the law, he came to fulfill the requirements of the law. Christ said, don't say that I am doing away with the law, but I have come to fulfill the law, or fulfill the requirements of the law. So he says, now here, to redeem them that were under the law. See, so why did Christ come? Christ came to redeem them that were under the law, that we might receive the adoption of sons. Now, keep this in mind here, is Paul is now arguing for a second on the principles that the Galatians were called in apart from the law. And the Judaizers have convinced them to go back to the law. Well, the Galatians were never underneath the law, because they were God-fearers, the Gentiles, who did not believe, who did not take on the certain religious customs of the Jews, but they believed in the God of the Jews. They were called God-fearers. So they had never underwent the process to become a true proselyte. So Paul had brought them in apart from the law. Judaizers convinced them to go to the law. They never initially wanted to go to the law. That's why they remained on the outside. And Paul is saying here that Christ came in the fullness of time to those that were under the law to bring them up. And so then even those Jews right now that are underneath the law, Christ is bringing them up back to the original covenant by faith, which covenant you Gentiles were already serving, because I brought you in that way. I brought you in underneath the covenant of faith. And now you drop back down, but Christ had come to bring them up, and you drop back down to where the Jews are. And so then what are you doing? That's what he's arguing here. He says, to redeem them that are under the law, that we might receive the adoption of sons. See, and what would be the adoption of sons? That God is bringing us into a full relationship with him, and now he's going to be investing us with certain privileges that a servant never has. So then Paul is astonished that you had bypassed the time previous of being just a child. You had come past the ceremony into being a full adopted son, and now you went back to being an unadopted son, which makes you no different than a servant within the economy of God. So then you're going to serve God not according to the Spirit, but you're going to serve him according to a bunch of do's and don'ts, religious regulations. Well, that's miserable for anybody to serve God under religious regulations. And Paul is astonished by this. So then Paul is saying you're giving up your freedom and you're going back to slavery here. And he's going to argue that Christ redeemed us from the penalty of the law. Remember, in the last lesson, in the fifth lesson, Paul explained that the law carried a curse, but faith carried a blessing. And the Jews in the wilderness refused to serve God according to faith, so they went and served God according to the law, but the law carried a penalty, and everybody who served God according to the law were underneath that penalty of that law. So then he is astonished by this right here. But so then he's saying, though, that if you serve God according to faith, because Christ came to open that way to where you could have the time appointed by the Father and you could have the rights of adoption, well, then you were entitled to certain rights and privileges as a son that you would never be as a servant or an unadopted son. So then this is what he's arguing here. He says, and because you are sons, God has sent forth the Spirit of his Son in your hearts, crying, Abba, Father. That's in some respects, it seems a bit odd, but what does he mean by this? Okay, so then, first and foremost, because you're now a full-fledged son, well, you have right to the Holy Spirit again. The Spirit that left Adam and Eve in Eden, it left them from that hour all the way up to the coming of Christ until the day of Pentecost. Humanity never had access to that Spirit again, the Holy Spirit that lived with them. And if you serve God according to the law, you don't have access to it. Well, that's that in itself would be enough reason. But Paul, enough reason, let alone all the rest of the privileges. But then if he brings you in, now he's bringing you in and he's changing the relationship from servant to son. Remember, the Israelites were always God's servant. They were never his son. You see, they were always the servant in the house, like the butler or the gardener. And Paul is contending here that God is now wanting to bring you from being a gardener or a butler. He's wanting to bring you into a new relationship as father and son. You don't till the fields anymore under rigor. So you don't serve God anymore under religious systems and regulations. You serve him out of the heart with the Spirit and the freeness and love. And you, at any time, you can talk to him. You don't have to wait for an appointment or speak to him in the manner that a servant would speak to his master, but you can speak to him in a manner that a child would speak to their father, because the Spirit is now in your heart. So it bridged that relationship and brought us back into the relationship of sonship, the relationship that Adam had before he fell. That relationship Christ came to restore. Why would any person ever want to go back once you've been brought into the relationship of sonship, that you can just pour out your heart to God and you can tell him for the goods and the bads how you feel, and you can just talk to him in an intimate manner? Why would you want to go back to being a gardener and you have to deal with him in a very astute, respectful manner, in a way that's impersonable? Why would you ever want to do that? And you have no right. It's not like you can just go in and sit down in the living room at leisure in the house, or even invite your friends over and you all visit in the dining hall like a son would. You see, no, a servant has no rights to even any of those things. And if they're a gardener, they don't even have any rights to come into the house unless they're bid. You see? And so Paul is saying that if you want to serve God under religious legalism, well, remember, you're just a servant and you don't have the privileges that a son would have. Humanity, all of them, Jews and Gentiles, were all in that shape until the coming of Christ, when he bridged that gap. So then this is what he's saying here. And then he says, he uses this term as an Aramaic term. He says, in your heart crying Abba, which is an Aramaic term, Abba, Father, which actually is a term of endearment. It would be likened unto saying daddy. So if I could read it that way, let me read it that way, and so we can gain the full context out of it. Paul said, and because you are sons, God has sent forth the Spirit of his Son in your hearts, crying, Daddy God. You see what Paul's saying? But now you have that relationship, you have that privilege. You can just walk up to the throne at any time and just talk to him. You see, why would you want to go back? Now, he drops down here in the 7th verse. He says, wherefore thou art no more a servant, but a son. And if a son, then an heir of God through Christ. Notice what he said. Look what what we are heirs of. Now you would think, well, an heir of a great mansion or a great business. We're heir of maybe a huge corporation. Paul says that what we are now actually heir of, we are actually heir of God. God belongs to us now, and we belong to him. You see, you remember how Christ looked up into heaven and said, God, I know you hear me always, but for those standing by, I say, and then he went on with his prayer. Notice the relationship here that Christ had with God. Christ had this relationship that God hears me always. Well, Paul is contending here that now that the Spirit is back in our hearts again, we are now heir of God. That is actually the standing that we have with God. We are heirs of God. We know that God hears us always. You see? And as Christians, we actually should lean into that. Christ, even making mention of this, said, don't do as the heathens do. Or we should say no longer, don't do as the heathens do. Make long prayers. They believe that for their repetitive words, that they'll be heard for many words, saying, oh, please God, oh, please God, oh, please God. Or you'll see oftentimes people say, they repeat a particular prayer, even in Christianity. Even in Judaism, they both do it. Today, they will believe that through saying repetitive words or long prayers that they'll be heard. And Christ said, no, you don't serve God that way. Not anymore. Under religious systems, you serve him that way because you're trying to garner his favor. But a child doesn't need to garner the Father's favor to be a child. He's always a child. That baby, the very second he is born, has a certain special standing that servants will never have. What is he? He's a child. He is a son or a daughter of the Father. You see? And so then he has certain privileges and claims, though he's done nothing at all. The child has done nothing, but yet he still has certain privileges and claims to the father that a servant, no matter how righteous a servant will ever be, no matter how good of a servant will ever be, and the master of the house might appreciate the servant immensely. However, he can never say that he is a son of the master. He is still a servant of the master. He's still his, maybe a hired hand. But the son, when he is born, though he's done nothing at all, he holds the title of a son. You see, and then this is what Paul is arguing, that God is now treating you in this relationship, in this manner, as a son, not a servant. Because when Christ came, he broke down the dividing wall between humanity and God, and was bringing us back into sonship. That's why the Bible says that he was the first one born among many brethren, and for this cause he's not ashamed to call us his brother. So then he was the first one born among many brethren. He brought us back into a full relationship. Why would you want to go serve God underneath a religious system that you become a servant? You're hoping then from that time forward to gain the master's favor, but as a child you have the master's favor, though you've done nothing at all for it. And so then Paul is laying heavily here on the concept that, you remember how Christ just had God's favor? Why? Because he was God's son. That's you now. You see, you have God's favor. And this was Christ was trying to say. See, Christ was trying to show us the proper relationship. He didn't say many prayers. He didn't have to say, oh, please God, oh, please God, oh, please God, oh, please God, oh, please God. You see, he didn't have to say all that. He didn't have to say so many repetitive prayers that maybe is given to us for penance or things like that right there. He said, don't do that. Why? Because a son doesn't need to do that. A son just walks up to the throne and talks. See, just walks up to his father and just starts talking. But a servant doesn't do that. Servant first waits till he's bidden, and then he tried to gain favor. And then if he wants something out of his master, he tries to work diligently so the master might, or his boss might, be pleased with him, that he would give him what he asked for. Maybe it's a raise or something of that manner. But a son doesn't need to do any of that because he holds the title as a son. Paul says, howbeit then, when you knew not God, you did service unto them which by nature are no gods. See, he's talking to Gentiles here, and you served pagan idols, or whatever the case may be. In our modern world, people often serve, let's say they serve money, or they serve the gods of power, or the gods of popularity, or the different things of this nature, but they're not gods. But yet you make them gods in your life, even though they're really not gods, because they're dead. They're dead idols. But you make them gods in the fact that you give your whole life for them. You see, he said, howbeit when you knew not God, you did service unto them which by nature are no gods. But now, after that ye have known God, or rather are known of God. See, notice he's correcting. You think you know God, but hold on. Hold on. Let me actually correct my statement here, or refine the statement here. He says, refining the statement, now God knows actually who you are. You see, not in the respect in God's omnipotence as if he didn't know who you were, but God knows you in a relationship now of son. You see, in a relationship of father and son. How turn ye again to the weak and beggarly elements whereunto ye desired again to be in bondage? You see, why would you turn back to trying to serve those things? And let me throw in just a brief statement here. Let's not think that we are immune from these things, because even though the Galatians, they were turning back to the Jewish law, which made them servants. Oftentimes we come into Christianity and we're saved. We come in underneath the auspices that we just want God's salvation. That's it. And we're so elated that when we feel that we have a relationship with God again, and the burden and the weight of our sins that's lifted off of us. But we get to serving God for a while, and then we desire to start becoming like the world. We figure that, let's say, popularity is a sign of God's favor, so then we want to make our church or our ministry the largest in the city. Or we think money is a sign of God's favor, so then we want to show everyone how wealthy we are. Or different things like that, whatever the case may be. What have we done? We came in serving God just by relationship, and then we've turned back to serving the beggarly elements, which are not gods. It's the gods that the world serve. They make them the God of their life. And they make them the God of their lives, but we don't. We know Jesus Christ is the God of our life. However, they make them the end-all, be-all. We come into Christianity, and it's not too long, we start making them the end-all, be-all again, thinking that this is how we garner favor in God, or how God shows his favor. And if we're not popular, or whatever the case may be, if we're not rich, then we don't have God's favor. We have turned again to the beggarly elements. This is Paul. And what did we do? We went back to being in bondage. The very same thing we were liberated from the day we got saved, we went back to serve them. He says, how turn ye again to the weak and beggarly elements whereunto ye desired again to be in bondage? See, Paul's astonished at the very concept, at the very idea. And so then he can't believe that the Jews would do such a thing, or not that these Gentiles would do such a thing, because why? Look what you've given up. So let's continue here. He says, now, put it in the proper context. I just put it in a modern day context, but putting it in the proper context, these Gentiles were going back to serve the law of the Jews. Okay. And he says, you observe days and months and times and years. I'm afraid of you, lest I have bestowed upon you labor in vain. This is a little bit sticky situation here. He says you observe days and months. What days were they observing? To be honest here, they were observing the religious days of the Jews. One is the Sabbath. They started going back, observing the Sabbath day as a holy day, which Paul implicitly taught that the Sabbath for the Christian was entering into Christ, and we cease from our works as God did originally his, and now we rest in Christ. But these Gentiles started going back and serving different days. They started serving the Sabbath day, or even high Sabbaths, which were yearly Sabbath, or a kind of a yearly holidays in modern terms. And months, certain months of the year to be like, let's say the day in the month of Tabernacles, or say these different holy days or holy months or holy weeks of the Jews. They went back to serving them. They began to keep them as if this was going to garner favor in the eyes of God. And Paul's going, you have returned back to bondage again, because remember, God only instituted those things to keep you straight. But as a servant, you didn't have relationship. You didn't have privileges as a child. You were treated as if you were a servant, and you were given strict orders as a servant. And it was to keep us straight until the time that that humanity was going to be adopted. But you've gone back to those things. And Paul said, well then, first off, if you went back to them, then what's my ministry? But this is from Paul's vantage point. What would be the point of my ministry? Because everywhere, in every city. There are those who serve Moses. The apostles in Acts 15 recognized this, and they agreed with Paul that in every city there are those who serve Moses. And what is Paul doing then if the net result is you're serving Moses? Then the ministry of Paul was without effect. It had no reason whatsoever, because Paul believed, and this is what he had conveyed to the apostles in Acts 14 and 15, and the apostles agreed with him, is the fact that Paul's ministry was to call people to the covenant of faith, not the covenant of the law, to whereby they may serve Moses. Paul was calling them to the covenant of faith. And in doing so, Paul believed that now that's a reason for me to go out, because I'm calling people to a brand new relationship. Remember how Paul said that I lay the foundation, which is Jesus Christ, which foundation no other man can lay. Every man who builds, he builds thereupon. Take heed how he builds. For if he builds with straw and stubble and sticks and anything like it shall be tested by fire, and it shall be consumed. Yet he himself shall be saved. So Paul was arguing the idea that he laid a foundation, and he was calling people to a certain relationship, a relationship that was only available to humanity after the arrival of Christ and the sacrificial death on Mount Calvary of Christ, and the subsequent coming of the Spirit to humanity. Again, Christ bridged the way between fallen humanity and a holy God. And then the Spirit is the thing that renewed the relationship and brought us across the bridge here. So then Paul is arguing that if you reject the Spirit and walk back across the bridge and you sit on the other side, then why did I come? Because my ministry is to get you to recognize that the bridge is available, and through the Spirit, get you to receive the Spirit and bring you into a new covenant, a new relationship, a covenant of grace and faith. And if you go back to the law, then, well, I didn't even need to go out at all. That was always in your cities, the availability of the law, you see? And the same thing I want to maybe echo here with Paul is if we go back to judging our relationship with God the same way the world judges their relationship, how do they judge whether or not they're successful? How much money they have, how popular they are, how much power they have, how these different worldly elements, how much they had garnered is how successful they are and how right they are, okay? If we as Christians, after we have been saved, we start judging ourselves or our church or other churches or other Christians by the same measures the world does, well, then we've done the same thing here Paul is worried about. We have rejected the relationship, and we've walked back across the bridge, and now we're serving God according to the beggarly elements of the world, which were a bunch of religious do's and don'ts. Or if we become legalism and we start judging how righteous we are by how closely we align with the certain religious tenets of our organization, the one that we happen to be in. You see, and we start judging how righteous we are in the eyes of God by how closely we align to these, or we judge others by how closely they align. Well, then we've done the same thing. We've walked back across the bridge, and then we have started serving God according to the beggarly elements, which are religious duties, the religious do's and don'ts, religious ceremonies, not through relationship of father and son. As Christ served God through relationship of father and son, that is our portion today. But if we're legalistic and we serve God according to legalism, then we have become in bondage again. You see, and this is what Paul said to these Gentiles here, and some of the Jews that had listened to his message, but by and large, the majority were Gentiles. He said, you desire to be in bondage again? That was a question. You observe days and months and times and years? You see, what were the years? Well, every 50 years there was a year of Jubilee. Different things like this right here. You're now laying back onto these customs, which, remember, they were just a foreshadow, showing what the real that was to come. Like the lamb on the altar was showing forth that there was coming a real lamb that would pay the sacrifice. The seventh, the last day of the week, was showing that there would come a time when that we cease from our labors. Again, like for example, here's why the seventh day of the week was just a foreshadow, and it wasn't true, but Christ became our true Sabbath, is because God didn't pick back up after he rested. He didn't pick back up on the eighth day and start creating again. But if the Jews always did, on Saturday they rested, and on Sunday picked back up and started working again. So it was obvious, and Paul argues this, and it was obvious that then that wasn't the true Sabbath, but there had to come a place to where if we wanted to keep God's true Sabbath, that we cease from our works, our labors, and cease forever, for eternity, for all, not pick back up the next day of the week and start laboring again, because God didn't do that. So where is the Sabbath wherein we rest continually for all eternity from our own labors? Well, that's when we find ourselves in Christ. When we find salvation, we quit trying to earn God's favor. We don't need to earn God's favor. We have God's favor. Why? Because we are sons and daughters. You see, Christ had God's favor. He didn't need to earn God's favor. He had it when he was born in Bethlehem. You see, remember the angels came and sung over him? He had God's favor because he was God's son. He didn't need to earn God's favor. And when we enter into Christ, we cease from our labors. What labors are we ceasing from? Those labors that we're ceasing from are the labors in which we display or work, trying to earn God's favor, trying to earn our righteousness in the eyes of God. We don't need to do that anymore. We're sons. We're daughters. We have it. There's no need to earn it. You see, now we can just cry, Papa God. You see, we have it. We can say, like Christ, I know you hear me always, God. We can walk into our prayer room, wherever it may be, our bedroom, or even, even at work, bow our head at our desk, whatever the case may be, and say, God, I know that you hear me always. Why? Because of anything that I've done? No. But you see, because I ceased from my labors. I've entered into Christ. I'm entered into his labors through faith. See, and this is what Paul is arguing here. And he's saying, now I'm afraid because you went back to trying to earn God's favor through and trying to display it through days and months, days of the weeks or months or certain years or inserting certain duties or legalism or certain dress codes or these different things. You're going back to trying to earn God's favor. And it makes me afraid of you, because then there was no reason for me to go out into the region of Galatia, into Antioch, of Pisidia, Lystra, Iconium, and Derbe. There was no reason for me to even go if you're going to go and try to serve God that way, because you always had that. Even you Gentiles were always trying to serve God according to some religious rite. Why did I even go on a missionary journey? You see, that's what Paul is contending here. Now let's go down to the 12th verse here. He says, "Brethren, I beseech you." See, Paul's pleading with you. I do want to drop a little hint in here. Notice how Paul led his churches. Paul never led his churches through being a dictator, and through dictating and demanding. You do this. Look, he's talking to the elders here, the elders that he established. He appointed these elders here. Okay? And he's talking to these elders. And how does Paul lead the elders that he himself appointed in the churches that he established? Paul pleads with them, not demands and dictates. So when that right there, that is not the proper model when you have a person who dictates. Paul says, "Brethren, I beseech you, be as I am." You see, serve God like me. Serve God like me. Look, I might not be the most righteous person in the world, but I serve God according to faith. I might not be, and Paul knows he's not the strictest observer of the religious works and the religious laws. As a matter of fact, he is probably considered the most laxed. Certainly amongst the church in Jerusalem, Paul is considered the most lax. Well, Paul nowadays eats pork. He eats things sacrificed to idols. Paul eats with Gentiles. He knows he's not the most strict observer of the law. But what does Paul do? Paul has crossed the divide, and he's entered into the house, God's house, and he stands there as a son. So Paul says, be like me, guys. Paul knows that he has a better relationship with God than the Pharisees do. And God will hear him quicker than he will 10,000 upon 10,000 Pharisees. You see, who may even stand at the Wailing Wall and wail all day long, and yet and God will never hear them. And yet one little small prayer from this aged apostle, Paul knows God will hear him. See, that's what he's saying. I plead with you guys. I'm begging you, be like me. Serve God the way I serve God. Be as I am. For I am as ye are. You see? And now he's going, well, what do you mean? I'm as you are. Well, guys, I'm weak too. You see? I'm not perfect either. But I don't try to serve God with my righteousness. I don't try to serve God under legalism, under religious writs. You see? You would think, well, the reason I want to do this is because I want God to be happy with me. Well, that's a good desire, right? And so then that's why I'm keeping a certain day of the week, or why I'm trying to fast so many days out of the week, or why I am keeping these legalistic tents that my church requires me to do. Maybe it's a certain dress code or something like that right there. I'm doing these things because I feel my sinful inadequacies and I'm trying to gain favor with God. And Paul says, guys, I'm just the same as you. I feel inadequate as well. I feel like I can never measure up to God's righteousness. I know. So then I don't try. You see, I lean on Christ's righteousness. So now his first sentence here makes sense. He said, brethren, I beseech you, be as I am, for I am as you are. Ye have not injured me. You see, you rejected serving God the way that I told you to, and the way that I do. You haven't injured me. You see, you haven't done harm to me. You know how that through infirmity of the flesh I preached the gospel unto you at the first. You see, you didn't turn around and they said, the Judaizers were saying that Paul was weak. And Paul had no authority, and Paul didn't know what he was talking about. And so then Paul was lowly, and Paul was nothing. He didn't even have the right sanctions of the apostles. And the church in Jerusalem never told him to preach the message he's preaching, even though they did send him out. And you see, guys, you see, and we don't do this in Jerusalem. We serve God. We serve Christ according to these rituals, by still keeping the law. And so then reject Paul, reject everything about him. And so then in the human aspect, we would immediately feel in the human aspect, we would feel like a personal rejection. If somebody rejected what we said, we tend to by nature take it as a personal rejection. And then if you let's say reject what I said, and you say he's wrong, then you make that person lowly. So notice what Paul is saying here is, I know you rejected now the gospel that I preached, and you now started going to another gospel and started serving God according to these rituals. And now you've rejected me, so then obviously that puts me in the wrong, right, in your eyes. But you didn't make me lowly, friends, because I came to you already low. I was the lowest of the low. And that's the way I came to you, as the lowest of the low. So it's not like you make me lower. Now, this is a pretty humble man speaking then. But Paul was crushed on the road to Damascus. And you never see that pridey Paul again. That lofty lifted Paul had no pride anymore after Damascus Road, as we said before. And I imagine that his time in Arabia was an existential identity crisis. That wasn't a time when Paul figured out his doctrine. That's when Paul was trying to reprocess his identity. So look what Paul says here. He says, ye know that through infirmity of the flesh I preached the gospel unto you at the first. Some believe there's two thoughts here. One is that Paul always was troubled with his eyes, and Paul was referring to that. Another is believing that Paul when Paul first hit the mainland, it's believed that Paul may have gotten malaria. And then because he had intended to go towards Rome or Greece, and because he took ill, which some believe that illness that he took when he hit the mainland was malaria, then this is actually where John Mark left, that Paul stayed local in that region. And so then if that's the case, then Paul ended up preaching to the Galatians because he had taken sick and didn't want to venture anymore outside of the region. So those are the two thoughts here. But at any rate, Paul said, you know how that through the infirmity of the flesh I preached the gospel unto you at the first, and my temptation which was in my flesh, see the sickness that Paul had was in his flesh, or made him weak. His weakness was in his flesh. Ye despised not, nor rejected me. Now, if it was his eyes, Paul's history believes that Paul's eyes watered profusely after seeing the Logos on the road to Damascus, after seeing the great pillar of fire. After he saw that, from that time forward, Paul had eye problems. So then, if it was his eyes, then his eyes, it's believed that his eyes watered profusely. If it wasn't his eyes, if it was a sickness like malaria, then you can imagine that Paul was here trying to preach to them, steadily coughing and weak, and people are having to hold him up or help him to sit down, help him to stand up so he can preach. Maybe somebody is coming over and holding him up, giving him a shoulder to lean on. And Paul's trying to preach the gospel while he's coughing and weak and sick. And yet Paul's telling them that you didn't despise me because of this. You see, you saw how weak I was. And then now I'm trying to preach a gospel to you, and yet you still didn't despise me in that hour. So remember, I came as the weakest of the weak. So by rejecting me, you don't injure me. You don't weaken me anymore. Remember how weak I was when I came to you. So if I can put it in, paraphrase it here, guys, you're not hurting my reputation. You know, you're not putting me down. I came as the lowest of everybody. Even look how weak I was and sick I was when I came, and I was in a pathetic shape when I came there, and started preaching. But you guys didn't reject me because of it. You see, so then don't think that by rejecting my gospel here that you're making me low, but you received me as an angel of God, even as Christ Jesus. You see. Paul, you at that time looked past all of my own infirmities and inabilities, and you received me as if Jesus Christ was coming to you with a message, because they were so elated that they could receive God apart from the Jewish customs. They did not have to become proselytes. If you're wondering what all of that is, go back to the first and second lesson in this series, and you'll get picked. We deal with that there. So look, he says in the 15th verse, where is then the blessedness you spoke of? You see, because they said that they were so blessed that Paul came. So where is now the blessing? Now you left my message, and now you're serving according to the way some other Christians serve God. They're serving Christianity according to legalism, and you've rejected my message. But at the time, you could not get over how elated you were about the blessing of the message that I was bringing you into Christianity apart from the law of Moses and not requiring you to become a proselyte. You see, for I bear you record, see, I'm just quoting back to you, that if it had been possible, you would have plucked out your own eyes and have given them to me. That statement here is what lends to the idea that it was probably Paul's eyes and not the malaria. Some believe that it may have been a little bit of combination of Paul took sick, but his eyes always bothered him. But he did take sick, and that's why he stayed in the region. But at any rate, whatever the case may be of the two, but Paul here lends to the fact that his eyes, well, and if you ask, my personal opinion on it is that Paul probably suffered from migraines extremely bad, and his eyes did water profusely, according to history. And Paul had a problem even speaking at length at times because his eyes hurt him so bad. I believe that Paul probably suffered with migraines real bad after that incident. And so then it was not that Paul took malaria or a sickness like a chest cold or something like that, but Paul started suffering from these weaknesses of that he couldn't travel long. His migraines were bothering him. His eyes were watering profusely. And so then he stayed local because he had a flare-up of new bouts from all of this. And that's why he stayed local. So he didn't go to Greece. He stayed in Galatia, in that region of Galatia. And yet this is what he's talking about. So it's all encompassing. That's what I believe is the correct interpretation of that. But at any rate, Paul says, for I bear you record that if it had been possible, you would have plucked out your own eyes and have given them to me. You see, mine were so bad that you were you were so grateful to me for coming and giving you the gospel that you could be free and you could serve God. You had free access to God, that you were so happy about that you received me even as Jesus Christ himself almost. And you would, at the time, were willing to do anything for me, anything that I asked. And if it was possible, you'd have given me your own eyes and walked around a blind man. You were that elated with me. You see? So now Paul is going to hearken back to their common affection one towards another, because they were told that Paul lied to them. Okay? And so then they were told that Paul lied to them, and so then they started becoming, and that Paul had deceived them. So then they had started to become a little bit hard-hearted towards Paul. So now Paul is reflecting back to their mutual friendship and feeling towards one another back in the days in which I preached amongst you. So that's where he's going here. He says, am I therefore become your enemy because I told you the truth? Now, you see, notice, again, they said that Paul deceived you. Paul is relentless in his idea that, no, I didn't deceive you. I told you the truth. I not only told you the truth, but I told you a higher way, and you reverted back. Then do you hate me because I told you the truth? You see, I know the truth makes you unpopular at times, and it made you unpopular amongst the Judaizers, those who had come from Jerusalem. The apostles, the reason why I say that they come from Jerusalem is because the apostles in their original letter that they sent north from Jerusalem after the Jerusalem Council, they said, we know that there were certain of us that went out from us and preached to you, but they preached according to their own authority. We didn't tell them to say these things. So I know that Paul's like, I know that this makes what I say, I told you the truth, and the truth at times makes you unpopular. Well, friends, that's the same today. You serve God's truth, and it's going to make you unpopular. If you find a truth in this church, then another church down the corner is going to not like you for it. But if it's the truth, it's the truth. And then vice versa. If you find a truth in a church down the corner that they're holding to a biblical truth and you hold to that, then maybe your current church you're going to be unpopular with it. You see? But the truth at times will make us unpopular. This is what Paul's addressing here. Am I therefore become your enemy because I told you the truth? He says, they zealously affect you, but not well. You see, you're getting all happy about it. And so they zealously affect you, but they're not doing it for your benefit. You see, they're not doing you any favors. They're not doing you well. They're not doing you good. Even though they might be gaining a lot of members, let's put it this way, in proper context. They're getting a big following, but you're following them in the wrong direction. So even though you're happy about it, and they affect you with a lot of zeal, a lot of charisma, and you're happy, but you're heading in the wrong direction, so they're not doing you well. Paul says, yea, they would exclude you. See? Paul excludes you. Why? They're cutting me off from you. So they're excluding you, saying Paul's all wrong. Paul's a deceiver. Paul's this, that, and the other. And so they exclude you from me. But I'm the one telling you the truth. But you're getting all happy about it. But the pair of you aren't doing well about it. He says that ye might affect them. See, they want to count your heads, how many members that they have in their following or their organization, or they want your money. You see, so they're not doing it for your good. I did it for your good. Everything that I told you for their good, for your good. They tell you things for their own good, and then they know that I would come in and tell you the truth again, so they exclude you and tell you that I'm your enemy because I'm lying to you. But it is good to be zealous. Sure, it's good to be all happy about things, zealously affected always in good things. You see, it's good to be zealously affected, very charismatically affected for the truth. And not only when I'm present with you, but you see, not for a lie, though. You understand? Not when I leave, then you turn right back around. You're blowing around, as the Bible said, with every wind of doctrine. While I'm there, you're all happy with me. But soon as I leave, the next person comes along and you're blown away by their doctrine, and now you think I'm your enemy. But remember, you're heading in the wrong direction. This is what Paul is saying here. He says, my little children, of whom I travail in birth again. You see, it's again because before I was praying day and night and laboring with you that you would gain the correct doctrine. You see, you would gain the correct doctrine and you found it. And I was like elated about the thing, Paul is saying. However, now you have need to be rebirthed again, which is an odd statement. He says, of whom I travail in birth again until Christ be formed in you. I desire to be present with you and to change my voice. For I stand in doubt of you, change my voice. Paul was in a letter, the whole context of the letter, Paul is pretty harsh. And so Paul's saying, I want to be with you, and then I could speak softly to you. But now I'm just worried about you guys. That's why I'm so harsh in my letter, because I'm really getting worried about you guys, that you're falling away from the faith. You see? So then, we're going to end this out here. What is the application here then? Okay, is live as a son, not as a slave. What? Don't try to garner God's favor by the things you say and believe and do. Try to receive, not garner. Notice the difference, or earn. When I say garner, I mean earn. Try not to earn God's favor by the things you say and do, but receive God's favor because you are his son or daughter. You have it. There's no need to earn it. The very second a child is born, a mother picks that child up and she is just in love with that child. And that child has never done one thing. And yet that child immediately has all of its mother's favor. The father runs out and calls everybody, takes pictures of the child, sends them to his friends and his associates and his family members, and tells everybody about it. And the child has never done one thing to make that parent so happy. The parent is just happy with the child because it's his child. You see? So what's the takeaway? Don't try to earn God's favor. You'll never do it. It'd be akin to trying to heat all of outer space with a match. Never try to earn God's favor. Receive God's favor because you are his son or daughter. Next thing is honor your spiritual leaders, those that are telling you the truth. Give them due respect, and don't make them always having to keep coming back to you and getting you back on the straight and narrow every single week. So, and then how do we do that? Is walk in the Spirit, be led by the Spirit. Let the Spirit affirm your adoption, not only to you, but to the rest of the outer world that sees you, that sees your life. You see, and so then try to serve God according to a son, and then you know that you have his favor. Of course, obviously, if you do something that displeases him, he lets you know it, and then you repent over it, and the blood of Christ cleanses us from all unrighteousness, as the Bible tells us. And as James said, that if we committed any sin, he is faithful to forgive us. But then just walk on. Don't lay in the sin that you committed, believing that now from this time forward you have to now earn his favor again. Don't do that. You see, so walk in the Spirit. And The final in the final verse here, and because you are sons, God hath sent forth the Spirit of His Son into your hearts, crying, Papa God. Just have that relationship with God to where you and Him are not at odds. You're not trying to earn His favor, but you and Him are beyond friends, beyond that He adores you, beyond that you adore Him. Just go even beyond that, knowing that God would do anything for you. If it was for you alone, He would come down and have died for you alone. He would have made the whole salvation process and performed it for you alone. That's the relationship you have with Him. Let it be special. So until next lesson, keep up, walk in the Spirit as He is in the Spirit.